no one expected the Great War to look like this. In the summer of 1914, Europe marched to battle in parades of optimism. Flags waved, brass bands thundered, and generals promised that the boys would be home before the leaves fall. They imagined a war of cavalry and glory, of crisp uniforms and decisive charges across open fields. Instead, within months, the landscape of northern France and Belgium dissolved into a wasteland of mud, wire, and corpses. Machine guns scythed through entire companies in seconds, and any attempt to cross open ground became suicide. By the winter of 1914, the Western Front had frozen into a static line stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The trench warfare was no longer an emergency measure, it was a way of life. Soldiers huddled in narrow, stinking ditches carved from clay, surrounded by sandbags, rats, and the ever-present stench of decay. Between them lay no man's land, a shattered strip of earth bristling with barbed wire, shell holes, and the bones of the last failed attack. Each side had the same grim formula. Days, sometimes weeks, of artillery fire to soften the enemy, followed by ranks of men climbing over the parapet to walk shoulder to shoulder into gunfire. The theory was simple: overwhelming firepower would crush resistance. The reality was horror. The defenders waited deep underground during the barrage, then emerged when the shelling stopped and slaughtered the attackers before they had crossed halfway. Tens of thousands died for yards of mud that could be lost again by morning. The general's faith in the big push shattered. Something had to change. Across the front, whispers spread of small raiding parties, teams of volunteers who crossed the wire under darkness to harass enemy trenches, capture prisoners, or gather intelligence. It was a desperate experiment, but it offered a glimmer of hope. Speed, stealth, and surprise might succeed where massed attacks had failed. The British, French, and Italians all tried their versions. The British raiders relied on brute courage, armed with clubs, grenades, and pistols. The French emphasized reconnaissance, quiet capture, and withdrawal. But it was the Germans who looked at these ragged, ad hoc teams and saw the seed of something much larger. Inside German headquarters, a new idea began to form. What if entire units could move like these raiders? What if they could break the enemy line not by brute force, but by infiltration, slipping through gaps, avoiding strong points, cutting off supplies, and collapsing defenses from within? The concept was radical. Traditional tactics demanded rigid lines and synchronized movements. This new vision called for independence, initiative, and chaos. The first experiments began in 1915 under Major Calso's assault detachment. The men were issued bullet shields, crude body armor, and special helmets meant to deflect shrapnel. They trained to move in small, scattered groups rather than dense formations, advancing in bursts from one crater to the next. But before they could properly test the theory, they were thrown into a desperate battle to plug a collapsing sector. Half the detachment was wiped out. The lesson was brutal but clear. Armor and heroics alone were not enough. The future lay in agility and precision, not protection. When Captain Willie Raw took command of the remnants, he saw potential where others saw failure. Raw reshaped the detachment into a living laboratory of modern warfare. He stripped away the heavy gear and reorganized the men into tight, flexible teams. Each had a purpose. Some carried light machine guns, others flamethrowers, others bundles of grenades. They would train to operate without waiting for orders, reacting to the battlefield in real time. Raw soldiers became something the German army had never seen before. Professional raiders, chosen for nerve, fitness, and aggression. They were not expected to march in parade lines or hold territory for long. Their mission was to move fast, strike hard, and vanish. In the freezing night of a training ground near Verdun, Raw's men rehearsed again and again in mock trenches built from sandbags and timber. They practiced silent approaches, coordinated grenade throws, and lightning attacks lasting less than a minute. Their officers watched closely, learning which combinations worked and which failed. This methodical experimentation, unusual in the rigid Prussian system, would soon bear deadly fruit. The air is damp and heavy, reeking of cordite and decay. You are 20 years old, crouched in a shallow trench, waiting for an attack that may never come. Your rifle is slick with mud. Your boots have dissolved weeks ago. Then, from somewhere out in the blackness, a flare bursts overhead. For an instant, the battlefield is white as daylight, and in that flash, you see shapes moving, not in lines, but in scattered knots. Silent, fast, a grenade arcs through the air, hissing. The world turns orange. By the time you raise your rifle, they are already inside the trench. That was the nightmare of the new German Stormtroopers, or stormtroops. The British soldiers who survived their raids would whisper the name with awe and dread. The Stormtroopers. By late 1915, their philosophy had crystallized speed over strength, shock over endurance. They did not attempt to flatten the enemy's entire front. Instead, they sought the weakest point, sliced through it, and poured chaos into the rear. They would bypass the toughest bunkers and leave them to be cleaned up by regular infantry. This approach, called infiltration tactics, was decades ahead of its time. Even within the German army, many doubted them. The High Command preferred predictable, large-scale offensives, not small autonomous units that might act on their own judgment. But the Stormtroopers' results were impossible to ignore. When Rowe's detachment finally attacked a French position in the Vosges Mountains in October 1915, their assault lasted only minutes. The artillery had fired for just long enough to shock the defenders, then lifted. The Stormtroopers surged forward in scattered groups, using shell holes for cover, hurling grenades before the enemy could recover. Within an hour, the French position collapsed with minimal German losses. The old generals called it luck. Rowe called it proof. The Stormtroopers' new tactics would soon spread across the entire front, reshaping the war in ways no one had anticipated. But for now, they were still an experiment, an untested weapon forged in mud and desperation. Far behind the lines, the great powers still believed that more guns, more men, more shells would decide the war. Yet in the dark corners of the trenches, something smaller and more dangerous was evolving. A new breed of soldier who would change how wars were fought forever. By early 1916, the German High Command had realized that Captain Willy Rowe's Storm Detachment was no longer a novelty. It was the only part of the army consistently breaking through enemy lines. His men were studied like a scientific experiment. Generals and observers traveled from other fronts to watch them train, sketching diagrams of formations, noting which weapons worked best in the cramped, suffocating world of the trenches. The transformation from theory to doctrine had begun. Rowe's men were equipped like no others. Gone were the long, unwieldy rifles that had defined 19th century warfare. In their place came compact carbines, trench knives, and the new lightweight Bergmann MP. It was a weapon born from necessity, a small, automatic firearm that spat bullets fast enough to clear a trench before the enemy could reload. To most soldiers, it looked strange, even crude. To the Stormtroopers, it was liberation. The standard German infantryman still carried a Gewehr 98, a beautifully crafted but long rifle ill-suited for confined spaces. Stormtroopers needed something that could be fired from the hip, swung around corners, or used in the dark. The MP-18, Seconds 32, round drum magazine gave them the rhythm of a storm, the sound of short, controlled bursts echoing down narrow passageways. They carried stick grenades in canvas sacks, sometimes 20 or 30 per man. These potato mashers became their signature weapon, perfect for clearing dugouts and bunkers. The thunder of an explosion, followed by a flash of light and a rush of boots, was enough to unravel any defense. Grenadiers learned to count the seconds of the fuse in their heads, throwing just as it was about to detonate, so it would explode mid-air or right as it landed. Timing meant survival. Other soldiers carried trench clubs, crudely modified tools of wood, and metal spikes for when the fighting turned silent and intimate. Pistols, too, were prized. The Luger P8, elegant and deadly, was often paired with a wooden shoulder stock that converted it into a carbine. The flamethrower, perhaps the most dreaded of their tools, arrived soon after. The mere sight of a man advancing through smoke with a hose of flames slung across his back was enough to send defenders fleeing. But few envied the flamethrower operators. The tanks they carried were heavy and dangerously flammable. To make all of this work, Rohr introduced an innovation that set his men apart. Specialization. Each squad of 10 to 12 men was divided by function. A machine gun team laid suppressive fire, grenadiers cleared paths, and riflemen protected the flanks. Flamethrowers and light mortars followed behind. Every man understood not just his own task, but how it fit into the squad's rhythm, an orchestra of violence conducted in seconds. Stormtroopers drilled in life-sized replica trenches built miles behind the front. They practiced moving under live fire, sometimes with real shells bursting overhead to harden their nerves. Rohr insisted that they act, without waiting for orders, what he called Selbstständigkeit, self-reliance. Commanders were told to observe, not to control. It was a small revolution in an army that valued obedience above all else. What made these men different wasn't only their equipment, but their mentality. They were volunteers, hand-picked for aggression and initiative. They were paid slightly more, fed slightly better, and allowed certain freedoms denied to the regular infantry. But they also knew the truth. Their missions were almost suicidal. They were the first to go over the top and the last to come back. A saying spread among them: "We fight today so others can rest tomorrow." One of Rohr's officers later wrote that their greatest weapon wasn't steel. They memorized every twist of the enemy trench, every corner where a machine gun might hide. Before a raid, maps were drawn from reconnaissance photos, and the men studied them like chessboards. When they finally crossed no man's land, every crater and sandbag was already familiar in their minds. The German command took notice. By late 1916, similar assault detachments called Sturmbataillone were being formed across the Western Front. Each one followed Rohr's template: elite troops equipped with the latest weapons and trained to strike quickly and independently. The movement began to attract attention even from the enemy. British intelligence reports described these mysterious new units with a mix of fascination and dread, calling them Stormtroopers. Some older officers saw them as reckless and undisciplined, violating the sacred order of command. To them, war was supposed to be mathematical lines of infantry, artillery, and supply. The Stormtroopers turned that logic inside out. They fought like hunters, not soldiers, exploiting instinct over orders. Yet, it worked. To the men in the trenches, the contrast was obvious. Regular infantry waited for hours under bombardment, then climbed into the open to die. Stormtroopers, by comparison, seemed almost untouchable. They moved like shadows, choosing their moment, striking, and disappearing before the enemy could react. Word spread quickly, and young soldiers began volunteering for the assault detachments in droves, hoping for a better chance of survival or at least a faster death. Every new weapon changed the shape of combat. The light machine gun, the MG-08-15, gave the squads a mobile base of fire. Smoke grenades created fleeting walls of safety between shell bursts. Even communication evolved, runners replaced by signal flares, whistles, and shouted codes that echoed down the line. Coordination was everything. If a single team hesitated, the attack could unravel in seconds. There were moments of dark humor, too. Before a raid, some men painted skulls on their helmets or tied scraps of cloth around their arms for identification. Others carried lucky charms or whispered old prayers. They knew that the first few minutes of a raid decided everything. If they broke through, they might live. If not, they would die nameless in the mud. But behind the glory lay exhaustion. The constant training, the raids, the expectation of perfection, these wore down even the toughest men. Rohr himself admitted that he was creating a machine that devoured its own parts. For every successful operation, dozens of others failed in silence, buried under official reports that never reached Berlin. Still, the promise was undeniable. Stormtroopers had found a new way to fight a modern war. Their doctrine, small, flexible, and fast, was about to be tested on a scale no one had imagined. From the mock trenches of their training grounds, they would soon march into the bloodiest experiment of all, Verdun, 1916. And in that cauldron of fire, the legend of the Stormtroopers would be written in steel, smoke, and terror. Verdun. February of 1916. The name alone would soon become a synonym for hell. When the first shells fell, they fell in such numbers that the earth itself seemed to dissolve. Forests vanished. Villages turned to dust. For the men on the front lines, the air became a living, choking thing, filled with iron and screams. And in the middle of that storm, Captain Willie Raw's Stormtroopers prepared for their real test. This was no nighttime raid or small experiment. Verdun was a full-scale assault, a calculated attempt to bleed France white. The Germans opened with an artillery barrage so dense that observers said the landscape looked as if it were boiling. And when the last shells lifted, the Stormtroopers moved not in the dense waves of traditional infantry, but in dispersed groups that melted into the smoke. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The French defenders, still dazed from the bombardment, heard only the thud of grenades and the hiss of flamethrowers before the attackers were upon them. These weren't ordinary soldiers, charging in panic. They were hunters. Each team knowing exactly where to go, which bunker to skip, which trench to bypass. They flowed through the line like liquid fire, avoiding strong points and striking at communication centers, command posts, and artillery crews. The principle was simple but devastating. Don't attack the enemy's strength, attack his system. By cutting telephone lines, destroying supply routes, and isolating pockets of resistance, Stormtroopers could collapse an entire sector without ever engaging its strongest points. Within days, the unthinkable happened. Fort Douaumont, the largest and most important fortress in the Verdun defences. 19 officers and 79 men, led by a sergeant named Kunze, crept up to the fort through fog and silence. Slipping inside, they found a skeleton garrison caught completely off guard. Within minutes, the Germans had seized the fort without firing a shot. The news spread like wildfire. For the French army, it was a psychological earthquake. For the Stormtroopers, it was vindication. Their methods worked brutally, efficiently, and with terrifying precision. But Verdun was also a curse. As the battle dragged on, the same tactics that had made the Stormtroopers so successful began to devour them. Each new attack demanded more raids, more infiltration, more speed. Losses mounted. The very qualities that made them elite — aggression, initiative, courage — guaranteed they were always in the first wave and rarely survived to see the second. Still, their doctrine was now gospel. By 1917, every German division had its own storm section. Veterans of Rurs. Original detachment trained the new recruits, spreading the gospel of infiltration across the army. The lessons were simple but revolutionary. Never attack in a straight line. Flow around obstacles. Never wait for orders. Seize the initiative. Don't conquer the field, paralyze the enemy. While other armies clung to rigid doctrines, the Germans had discovered flexibility. And soon, others would follow. The British watched with unease as reports arrived from captured prisoners. The French adjusted their defences, creating defence in depth, multiple trench lines, with reserves ready to plug gaps. Across the Alps, Italy faced its own reckoning. By the autumn of 1917, the Italian front had stagnated into the same endless slaughter. But in the misty valleys of the Isonzo River, a new plan was forming, one that would combine stormtrooper tactics with the raw desperation of two collapsing empires. At Caporetto, in October 1917, German and Austro-Hungarian forces launched a coordinated strike against the Italians. The morning began with a short, intense artillery barrage, thick with poison gas and smoke shells. The Italians, blind and coughing, never saw what came next. Stormtroopers slipped through the fog, moving in small squads, bypassing strong points and cutting through weak sectors. By noon, the front was collapsing. Entire Italian divisions were encircled before they even realized they were under attack. Panic spread faster than the gunfire. Officers abandoned their posts. Bridges were jammed with retreating men and wagons. By nightfall, the Germans had advanced 15 miles, a distance that would have taken months in trench warfare. Among the stormtroopers was a young lieutenant named Erwin Rommel. He would later become one of the most famous generals of the next war. But here, in the chaos of Caporetto, he was just a clever and relentless commander. With only 5 men, Rommel tricked a much larger Italian force, over 1,500 soldiers, into surrendering. He moved constantly, firing from different positions, shouting commands as if leading an entire battalion. His deception worked so well that when the Italians realized the truth, it was already too late. Caporetto was a masterpiece of infiltration and a catastrophe for Italy. In less than a week, 265,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. Another 10,000 lay dead, 30,000 wounded. The front disintegrated so completely that the Italian language gained a new word, Caporetto, a synonym for disaster. Yet even in triumph, the cracks in the German method were showing. The speed and shock that made stormtroopers unstoppable also made them fragile. They depended on flawless coordination, precise artillery, and nerves of steel. When any of those failed, the results were catastrophic. Consider the creeping barrage, one of the most daring and dangerous tactics ever attempted. Artillery fire would move forward in timed stages, advancing just ahead of the stormtroopers. The soldiers had to follow it closely, sometimes within 50 yards of the exploding shells. If the gunners miscalculated by even a few seconds, the barrage would fall short, killing their own men, and it often did. Still, the tactic worked often enough to keep it alive. The stormtroopers accepted the risk as part of the job. Even poison gas became part of their arsenal. Mixed with high explosive shells, it was fired ahead of the assault to sow confusion. Sometimes, the wind shifted, blowing the gas back toward them. There are accounts of stormtroopers fighting through clouds of chlorine or phosgene, their masks fogged and their lungs burning. Because retreating was not an option. For every successful raid that reached the newspapers, dozens failed silently in the dark. Whole teams vanished in no man's land, lost to machine gun fire or smothered in mud. Yet their stories rarely reached home. The German press spoke of glory and innovation, not exhaustion and death. In truth, stormtrooper missions were a gamble, sometimes brilliant, sometimes suicidal. Still, they achieved what no one else could. They made movement possible again. The Allies, horrified by the results at Verdun and Caporetto, scrambled to adapt. The British restructured their platoons to include smaller fire teams, with grenadiers and riflemen, modelled after German examples. The French experimented with similar infiltration units, though they never embraced them fully. The Italians, despite their disaster, created their own elite corps, the Arditi. The Arditi were a breed apart, volunteers who favoured daggers and pistols over rifles, often charging, screaming into enemy trenches, armed with little more than knives and grenades. They wore black uniforms and were seen by both sides as half-crazed and entirely fearless. But their casualty rates were catastrophic. Many units were wiped out in single operations. They had adopted the spirit of the stormtroopers, but not their methodical discipline. By the end of 1917, infiltration warfare had changed the face of the conflict. The age of the massive frontal assault was fading, replaced by something leaner, faster, more terrifying. Soldiers no longer feared the distant artillery as much as the silent shapes moving in the dark, men who appeared without warning, struck with precision, and vanished. In the smoke of Verdun and the valleys of Caporetto, the stormtroopers had proven that courage and chaos could outmatch mass and order. Their success convinced the German High Command that this new warfare could deliver the long-awaited breakthrough on the Western Front. And so, as the winter of 1917 Turn to the spring of 1918. Plans were drawn for one final, desperate gamble, a massive offensive that would hurl everything Germany had left into a single crushing blow. By early 1918, Germany's leaders believed they finally held a winning hand. Russia had collapsed in revolution, and the Eastern Front was quiet. Hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened troops could now be transferred west toward France. For the first time since the war began, the German Empire had the numbers, the experience, and the plan to break the stalemate once and for all. They called it Kaiserschlacht, the Emperor's Battle, but to the soldiers who would fight it, it had another name. The German High Command knew that America's entry into the war would soon tip the balance irreversibly toward the Allies. They had only a few months before fresh American divisions arrived in force. So the Germans would strike first, fast, hard, and deep, to divide the British and French armies, force one of them to collapse, and negotiate peace from a position of strength. The weapon to deliver this blow was not a tank, nor a new artillery system. It was the Stormtroopers, the Stormtroopers now refined, reorganized, and spread across every frontline division. They were no longer a small experiment. They were Germany's sharpest blade, honed by years of desperate innovation. March 21st, 1918. Dawn broke under a curtain of fog thicker than milk. For 5 hours, the British lines were pounded by one of the most intense bombardments in history. More than 6,000 German guns and over 3,000 trench mortars fired 3.5 million shells. The noise was so deafening that men in the rear thought the sky itself had cracked open. Gas shells, high explosives, and shrapnel mixed into one endless roar. Then, silence. The barrage lifted, and from the mist, they came stormtroopers moving in loose, broken waves, their faces masked, their figures distorted by smoke and vapor. British sentries, stunned and half-blind, barely had time to shout before the attackers were among them. The pattern was the same as Verdun, perfected to industrial precision. Stormtrooper squads bypassed strongpoints, flowed through gaps, and left resistance to be mopped up by regular infantry behind them. They moved like a living tide, cutting communication wires, capturing artillery, and isolating command posts. By nightfall, entire sections of the British Fifth Army had collapsed. In less than 24 hours, the Germans had advanced farther than they had in the previous 3 years of trench warfare. The front lines, long thought unbreakable, were now riddled with holes. British commanders, trained to expect static defence, were stunned. Some units fought to the last, others surrendered en masse, trapped in encirclements they didn't even see forming. At first, it seemed like a miracle. German soldiers who had spent years knee-deep in mud were suddenly walking on open ground again, through villages and fields that hadn't seen daylight since 1914. They captured thousands of prisoners, hundreds of guns, and mountains of supplies. Newspapers back home printed triumphant headlines. The breakthrough, bells rang in Berlin and Munich. But for the men on the ground, victory tasted like exhaustion. The pace was brutal. Stormtroopers advanced faster than their supply lines could follow. Horses sank in craters. Trucks bogged down in mud. Food and ammunition lagged miles behind. Within days, the men were living off captured rations, British tins of corned beef and biscuits, and sleeping in barns or shell holes. The further they went, the less coordination remained. Artillery couldn't keep up. Communications broke down. The sharp edge of the stormtrooper spear was blunting itself against distance and fatigue. The fog that had hidden their approach now turned against them. In the chaos of rapid movement, units lost track of each other. Some advanced too far and were surrounded. Others halted, unsure where the front even was. The German army had built a weapon for short, surgical strikes, not for a war of movement. Now it was moving faster than it could think. By the end of March, the German spearhead had driven more than 40 miles deep into Allied territory, the deepest advance since the war's early days. But they had failed to reach their true objectives: the vital rail and supply hubs at Amiens and Arras. Without them, the Allies could regroup and counterattack, and all the while, the Stormtroopers, always the first forward, paid the highest price. In some battalions, 2/3 of the men were killed or wounded within a week. They were the best soldiers Germany had fit, experienced, and motivated, and they were being consumed faster than they could be replaced. The High Command, intoxicated by the apparent success, ordered more attacks. Operation Mars, Georgette, Blucher, Gneisenau, each another throw of the dice, each another storm of steel and blood. For the men in the field, it was a nightmare of momentum. The constant movement meant no rest, no rotation, no time to bury the dead. When supplies failed, they ate what they could find. Some stormtroopers, half-starved, looted Allied canteens for chocolate and canned fruit, small luxuries in a world of mud and gas. They had broken the front, but now they were breaking themselves. By mid-April, the offensive had slowed to a crawl. Allied resistance stiffened, and fresh American units began to arrive. Their sheer numbers, and the endless flow of supplies from across the Atlantic, began to tilt the balance. German soldiers found themselves facing troops who were not yet broken by years of trench war. Young, well-fed, and eager to prove themselves. The dream of the breakthrough began to fade. The great advance of 1918, which had begun in triumph, was collapsing under its own weight. And yet, even as exhaustion and hunger tore through their ranks, the stormtroopers fought on. Their discipline, born of years of specialized training, held them together long after lesser units would have broken. In the villages and forests of northern France, they fought with bayonets and pistols, ambushing tanks, setting traps, and retreating in perfect order when counterattacks came. They were ghosts of the old army professional killers trapped in a war that no longer made sense. For many, the realization came quietly. One stormtrooper later wrote in his diary, "We were the sharpest knife, but our masters forgot that knives also cut the hand that wields them." The German offensive bled itself dry by the summer of 1918, over 240,000 casualties, and among them, the heart of the Stormtrooper Corps. Whole units ceased to exist. The survivors were shadows of their former selves, hollow-eyed men who had seen too much, fought too hard, and buried too many friends. Posters still showed heroic soldiers charging forward, faces lit by fire and glory. But in the trenches, the truth was different. The stormtroopers had won Germany its greatest victories, and in doing so, had destroyed the very force that could have saved it. By autumn, the Allies launched their counteroffensive the 100 Days. Reinforced by American troops and unshaken supply lines, they pushed the Germans back across the same ground that had cost so much to take. For the stormtroopers, it was the final retreat. They had been the cutting edge of an empire. Now they were its shattered blade. The same fog that once hid their attacks now covered their withdrawal. In the mud of Picardy and the Somme, men who had been symbols of fear and power trudged back toward a homeland that was starving, disillusioned, and on the verge of revolution. They had fought with unmatched skill, discipline, and courage, but courage could not refill empty stomachs or replace fallen comrades. When the armistice finally came in November, what remained of the stormtroopers marched home in silence. No parades greeted them. No medals waited. Only memories and ghosts. The war that had made them legends had also made them obsolete. Yet their legacy, the idea of small, fast, autonomous units, would not die. In the decades to come, it would rise again under new names, new flags, and new wars. And what remained was only the quiet. When the guns finally fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the men who had once been called Sturmtruppen didn't feel victorious or defeated. They felt emptied. For years they had lived in a world where time was measured in barrages and minutes of survival. Now there was only quiet. Many of them wandered back through ruined villages and barren fields, following the same roads they had once charged down at dawn. Some limped on shattered legs. Others coughed blood into rags. But worse than the wounds were the silences between them. The stormtroopers had fought with such speed and intensity that most could not remember the faces of the men who had died beside them. There were too many. In Berlin, civilians expected heroes. Instead, they saw hollow-eyed strangers. The veterans' arrival was almost ghostly trains, pulling in with soldiers who looked older than their years, their medals caked in mud. There were no bands, no parades. The empire they had fought for was gone. The Kaiser had fled to exile, and the new Weimar Republic that replaced him had no use for the symbols of the old war. For the stormtroopers, peace felt like betrayal. They had survived what seemed impossible, only to find their country accusing them of having lost. The infamous stab-in-the-back myth began to spread the poisonous claim that Germany had been betrayed by politicians and civilians rather than defeated on the battlefield. Many stormtroopers, adrift and angry, found themselves drawn into the violent politics of the post-war years. Some joined the Freikorps right-wing militias that fought communists in the streets and crushed uprisings with brutal efficiency. Others simply disappeared, unable to fit back into the world they had left behind. The war had changed them in ways that no one could see. Their methods, once revolutionary, had taught an entire generation that speed, surprise, and autonomy could overcome larger forces. But those same ideas, transplanted into politics, became a dangerous seed. In the chaos of Weimar Germany, former stormtroopers found a new kind of battlefield, one fought not in trenches, but in rallies, riots, and paramilitary organizations. Historians would later debate whether the stormtrooper ethos helped pave the way for the militarization of German society in the decades that followed. What's certain is that the tactics they pioneered didn't die in 1918. They evolved. Their infiltration methods became the blueprint for a new generation of warfare. When armies across the world studied the First World War, they saw in the stormtroopers a glimpse of the future. The French developed shock sections in their infantry. The British refined their platoon structure to include flexible fire teams. The Italians, still haunted by Caporetto, created the Arditi as permanent assault units. Even the United States, though late to the war, took notes. The very idea of decentralized command giving small units freedom to adapt was revolutionary. Before the stormtroopers, orders flowed one way, from generals to soldiers. The best soldiers weren't just obedient. They were creative, fast-thinking, self-reliant. That philosophy would echo through every elite force that followed. From the British SAS to the US, Navy SEALs, from Soviet Spetsnaz to modern special operations around the world. Yet behind the innovation lay tragedy. The stormtroopers were victims of their own success. Their daring and skill gave the German high command false hope. The illusion that tactical brilliance could compensate for strategic weakness. It could not. Their victories were spectacular, but unsustainable. Each triumph bled them dry, until nothing was left to achieve the next. Letters from survivors paint a portrait of weary men who knew they were fighting for something already lost. One wrote, "We broke the line again and again, but every time we looked back, there was no one behind us." Another described watching his comrades advance through fog, so thick that only their silhouettes were visible. They moved like ghosts. And then they were gone. When the mist lifted, the ground was full of bodies. No one ever called it victory again. For those who returned home, life was a strange afterthought. The skills that had made them elite aggression, decisiveness, detachment, were useless in peacetime. Some became policemen, others factory workers, a few mercenaries. Many could not sleep without hearing the echo of grenades or the hiss of flamethrowers. In taverns, they avoided talk of the war, but their hands still twitched at sudden noises. In the early 20th century, no one spoke of post-traumatic stress. Men were expected to bear their memories like medals. But in private letters, diaries, and hospital records, their pain is clear. Some turned to alcohol, others to violence. Some simply walked away from their families and vanished. Yet not all their stories ended in darkness. A few survivors became instructors, passing their hard-earned lessons to new generations of soldiers. Their influence spread far beyond Germany. During the Second World War, the very same infiltration principles, lightning attacks, mobility, and initiative would resurface in the German blitzkrieg. But the spirit was the same. Strike fast, exploit confusion, move before the enemy can think. Even their aesthetic survived. Photographs of stormtroopers in their coal scuttle helmets and dark gas masks became symbols of fear. The faceless, unstoppable warrior of the industrial age. Later, propaganda artists would borrow their silhouette to depict the modern shock troop as a perfect machine of war. Behind every mask was a boy who once carried his mother's photo in a pocket, who laughed over coffee in the trenches before his first raid, who wrote home about snow and Christmas lights before vanishing into the mud. The stormtrooper's legend, the ruthless, inhuman soldier, hides the truth that they were among the most human of all. They were terrified, determined, improvising under conditions no training could prepare them for. Their courage was both their strength and their curse. It gave them purpose in a world without meaning. But it also trapped them in a cycle of sacrifice that their commanders never fully understood. They were sent into battles that could not be won, expected to achieve miracles with dwindling ammunition and fading morale. They delivered those miracles again and again until there was no one left to deliver them. And when it was over, the world barely noticed. In the peace treaties and political upheavals that followed the war, the stormtroopers were just another statistic, another part of a war that everyone wanted to forget. Their names faded from the rolls. Their units were dissolved, but their shadow lingered. In the interwar years, military thinkers like J. F. C. Fuller and Heinz Guderian studied their methods. Fuller, a British theorist, described them as the first modern soldiers of maneuver. Guderian, who would later command Germany's panzer divisions, called them the fathers of blitzkrieg. In that sense, the stormtroopers never truly died. They became the foundation for the wars of the 20th century. Wars fought not by massed lines, but by mobility, speed, and precision. Their legacy also reached into the moral dimension of warfare. The stormtroopers blurred the line between soldier and assassin. Their stealth, their night raids, their disregard for honorable battle changed how the world viewed combat. No longer was victory about banners and drums. It was about fear, confusion, and the collapse of order. Modern warfare, with its drones, commandos, and surgical strikes, owes as much to their dark art as to any general's theory. In the end, the stormtrooper story is not just about war, it's about transformation. They were born in mud and desperation, forged into something new by necessity, and destroyed by the very success that defined them. They began as men trying to survive an impossible conflict and ended as symbols of a new kind of war. Faster, deadlier, and more intimate. And so, as the veterans of the Great War faded into history, one could still trace their footsteps from the trenches of Verdun to the mountains of Caporetto, to the fields of northern France, and eventually, to the doctrines that would shape the next century of conflict. They were the storm fierce, brief, and unforgettable. And though the thunder has long since died away, its echo still rolls through the ages. The stormtroopers vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. When the armistice ended the Great War, their units were disbanded overnight, their banners packed away, their names struck from rosters. There were no commemorations, no monuments carved in their honor. For the new German Republic struggling to survive economic collapse and revolution, the stormtroopers were an uncomfortable reminder of a war that had devoured millions and left Europe hollow. But history has a way of preserving what governments forget. In the silence after the war, their influence seeped into every corner of military thought. Across the world, generals, strategists, and dreamers studied their brief but astonishing record. Somewhere between the muddy trenches of Verdun and the ruins of Caporetto, they had reinvented the very nature of warfare, and the world would never go back. For centuries, armies had been built on hierarchy, orders from the top, obedience from the bottom. The Stormtroopers shattered that tradition. They proved that initiative, individual judgment in chaos, could be as decisive as any general's command. Their small group tactics prefigured the modern world of squads, commandos, and special forces. In the next great conflict, this philosophy would evolve into what the Germans called Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement. The Lightning War, Blitzkrieg, was born from their legacy. The armoured spearheads of the 1940s were stormtroopers with engines fast, flexible, striking where the enemy least expected. Tanks replaced grenades, aircraft replaced creeping barrages, but the logic remained the same: speed, surprise, and disruption. Even the way soldiers communicated, with radios replacing shouted orders, came directly from the stormtrooper doctrine of autonomous squads. Yet their influence reached further than the battlefield. The stormtroopers had also transformed the psychology of war. They were the first true soldiers of modern fear, anonymous, masked, advancing through smoke and darkness. Their image, the steel helmet, the gas mask, the black silhouette rising from the fog, became the archetype of the 20th century warrior. You can still see it in propaganda posters, comic books, even in the design of later combat helmets. They became an icon not just of power, but of the dehumanization that industrial war had unleashed. And beneath that steel mask lay the real tragedy. Most of those men never lived to see what their ideas became. The few survivors who returned to civilian life were haunted by both pride and guilt. They knew they had changed history, but they also knew the cost. One veteran wrote in 1925, "We learned to move like smoke and strike like fire, but when we returned home, there was nothing left to burn except ourselves." Their generation carried invisible wounds that would take decades to name. Shell shock. They called it then a trembling of the hands, a stammering voice, a mind trapped between memory and nightmare. In truth, it was trauma, the same force that still haunts soldiers today. Stormtroopers, more than most, lived inside that trauma. Their missions were intimate, personal, and often suicidal. They killed up close. They saw the whites of the enemy's eyes. They felt the heat of flamethrowers and the shockwave of their own grenades. No one came back untouched. The German writer Ernst Junger himself, a stormtrooper officer, tried to capture that experience in his memoir, Storm of Steel. His prose was cold, precise, and almost detached. Junger described war not as madness, but as transformation, a crucible that forged a new kind of man. Hardened, emotionless, adapted to chaos. His book became required reading in military academies across Europe. Some read it as a warning, others read it as a blueprint. And that is perhaps the darkest part of the Stormtroopers' legacy. Their methods survived not because they were humane, but because they were effective. They made war faster, more lethal, and more impersonal. When the Second World War came, many of the officers leading the German army had once been stormtroopers or their students. They applied the same logic, decentralization, infiltration, coordination, on a far grander scale. The world would again feel the shock of sudden, overwhelming assault. But it wasn't just Germany that learned from them. The British studied their infiltration tactics and used them to form the Special Air Service, trained to operate independently behind enemy lines. The Americans built the Rangers on similar principles. The Soviets developed deep penetration troops, razvedchiki, to infiltrate enemy defenses. Even small nations began forming elite assault teams modeled after the same doctrine. Yet there is an irony at the heart of the Stormtrooper story. The very qualities that made them brilliant in war made them broken in peace. Discipline, aggression, independence. All virtues in combat became curses in civilian life. Many veterans felt alienated in a society that no longer valued their skills. Some became mercenaries in the conflicts that followed the Great War, fighting in the Baltic states, in Poland, or in the chaos of civil war. Others drifted into extremist politics, seeking belonging in movements that promised order and purpose. In the cafes of Berlin and Munich, Men with Stormtrooper tattoos or medals on their tunics sat in silence, staring into their drinks as the city moved on without them. The roar of the front had been replaced by the clatter of streetcars. The discipline of battle had turned into the aimlessness of unemployment. They were relics of a world that no longer existed, but one that still lived in their minds every night. By the 1930s, new leaders would rise, who remembered their service and understood their resentment. They promised to restore pride to a broken nation, to turn its soldiers' humiliation into strength. And in that promise, the spirit of the Stormtrooper, the myth of the elite fighter, who could achieve the impossible, was reborn in propaganda and ceremony. The symbol of the assault soldier, helmet gleaming under torchlight, once again marched at the front of the parade. The men who had fought in the mud of Verdun and Caporetto might not have recognized what their legacy had become. What began as a desperate attempt to escape the futility of trench warfare had evolved into the backbone of mechanized conquest. The idea of the small, fast, decisive unit had been taken from them and turned into the engine of total war. And yet, beyond the politics and the horror, there was something deeply human in what they represented. The Stormtroopers embodied the eternal struggle of men trying to adapt to a world that had changed faster than they could. They were innovators born from despair, forced to rewrite the rules of survival. In their courage lay both genius and tragedy. Today, their descendants wear different uniforms and fight in different wars. Commandos, special forces, counter-terror units, but the essence remains the same. Autonomy, precision, initiative. When modern soldiers slip behind enemy lines or clear a building room by room, they are walking in the footsteps of those young men from 1915 who first learned to fight not as masses, but as minds. The irony is that their greatest contribution to humanity was not their victories, but their lesson. They proved that even in the darkest conditions, ingenuity can bloom, and that even the most brilliant solution to a problem like war only deepens the tragedy of it. Their story is both a testament to human creativity and a warning about its cost. If you stand today on the old battlefields of the Western Front, in the forests of the Vosges, the ridges near Verdun, or the quiet valleys of Caporetto, you might still find traces of their presence. Rusted helmets, fragments of grenades, the outlines of old dugouts hidden beneath the grass. The wind moves across those fields as it once did through the smoke. And in that wind, if you listen long enough, you can almost hear it. The whisper of boots in the fog, the echo of a discipline born from desperation. They were soldiers who lived fast and died faster, men who turned the static horror of trench warfare into something terrifyingly alive. Their storm burned bright, brief, and beautiful in its terrible way. And though the war ended more than a century ago, the world they created still lingers in every commando raid, every lightning strike, every doctrine that prizes initiative over obedience. The Stormtroopers are gone, but their storm never truly ended. It simply changed its form. It lives now in the way wars are fought, in the silent precision of modern soldiers. They were the first to prove that in the machine age, even human courage could become a weapon of mass production. And that, perhaps, is their most haunting legacy.